All right.
Okay,
Fantastic.
so if you're uncomfortable being recorded, now's the time to drop off. Sergi, why don't you please go introduce yourself, and then it's all yours.
Thank you. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. All right. This is wonderful. Thank you, Peter, for inviting me to this meeting. Let me just put it in share mode. So this is Surajit Sen. I'm a professor in physics at UB. And right now, actually, I'm not in UB. I'm on leave at USAID in Washington, although I'm home because of obvious reasons. But I'll be back, and when I get time, usually weekends and evenings, I try to do some physics with my students. So that's my predicament. This work began somewhat like 6, 7, 8 months ago, when my friend Amitava, who is a professor in Perth, Australia, and I got talking, and we figured that we could construct some kind of a local scale agent-based model of how coronavirus pandemic is spreading. So that was a long time ago, and of course, much has changed since. And you'll see a lot of the old stuff in what I'm going to tell you. So I'm a theoretical physicist, that's my background, but my focus is dynamical systems, especially dynamical many body systems or many particle systems, or in this case, many agent systems. That's what I do for both physical as well as social systems. Social systems, not as much as physical systems, but social systems we have done for many years now. So we'll use this complex systems approach. The idea of a complex systems approach basically is that you don't really rely on equations so much, but you rely on much more granular description, and therefore your dependence, if you will, on rate constants, etc., is less, because things can change step by step if need be. And in many very complex problems, that's often the case, and therefore this kind of a modeling approach has its merits. It also has its costs. And notably, the main cost is computing time, many parameters that enter. So you want to find out which are the sensitive parameters and which are the robust parameters that are not very at least that don't need very careful attention, if you will. Peter has been one of the guiding lights of the study. Robert Edelman is my colleague from sociology. Robert has been the Sociologist Award. We have just begun our work. Aman is an undergraduate student, and he has been trying to do some work that I'll mention at the very end. Why is it not moving? Maybe this way. Okay. So this group doesn't need more lecturing on how bad the situation is. This is taken from November 15 NBC News website. And you can see the numbers. More than 10 million is dark red. And there are lots of dark reds out there. 1 to 10 million is not so dark red, and lots of that there. So excepting for a few places like Greenland and some areas like you see here, and parts of Africa where the data may itself not be there very much, and Mongolia, things are in pretty bad shape. And as Peter just mentioned, the situation is really bad here. I took the data for southern tier from, this is yesterday's data, and you can see that the numbers are higher than they have ever been. So that's very disconcerting, and that's why I was asking about the regionality, which is one of the things that we are trying to look at right now. Getting started, and I've been lectured by sociologists that don't use zip codes, but we only have zip codes, so we are struggling with it. So I'll go slowly because the stuff is maybe a little bit complicated if you're hearing it for the first time. This is just to give you a reference of sorts. You know that between late March, when things began to get really bad, and mid-May or so, for Western New York, the number of hospitalization cases and the number of ICU cases was looking like the way I show in the picture here. And this is what we'll try to model, for example, among one of the things that we'll look at. And we want to ask the following questions. First, can we make a generalizable model that can roughly capture the dynamics of COVID-19 dispersion in Western New York City, and other places? And the answer seems to be a resounding yes. You can make a generalizable model that can roughly capture the dynamics of COVID-19 reasonably well. The issue is whether the way you are capturing is the right way, whether it's unique. It's not. That's the problem. Can the model capture behavior at the community level? For example, COVID-19 dispersion in marginalized communities. And the answer is possibly so after some refinement. We also may need some levels of data that we may not have to make good predictions, to make predictions that are high quality. But can we make rough predictions? Possibly, yes, we should be able to. What information do we need for a model to describe a small region? Do we have that information? Family level information is available in census data. Census data, of course, is quite complex. That's why Aman is helping me, and Robert is working with us and guiding us. So it's not easy, but it can be gotten from what we are seeing. I'll tell you about the robust variables and what are the sensitive variables in a moment as we proceed. And can we learn enough to construct robust, sustainable, and implementable policies? That's too early to tell. So let's move on. And you can stop me anytime, okay, if you have a question. So I can't see each of you when I do this presentation. I'm only looking at my screen and talking. Setting up the problem. This part is quite delicate. So we take a population to be n, and the number of days simulated to be 50. Why? Well, that's partly because these are computationally expensive simulations. So we didn't want to get stuck for a month and a half just simulating something. And so 50 days seemed like a reasonable number. And we also make an assumption that in 50 days, each person goes to a public place about 4 times. So this is a very averaged assumption. And that's the case for me. I don't know if that's the case for everybody else, of course, in the pandemic times. So if you're then counting the total number of trips, it's 4n. And if you divide that by the number of days, 4n over 50 is the number of trips and hence the number of time steps per day, if you will. At the very least, you need to do that. We track only those people selected to visit a public place at a given time. So we don't track the whole population. This is very much in keeping with the simulations of Epstein and company at Johns Hopkins, where they only tracked people who went out and so on. There were several other groups that also tried that approach to keep the computational complexity and data storage within limits. We will approach the problem of COVID spread in terms of an underlying variable. I just came up with it, the effective viral load variable, EVL. And I denote the average over many people to be PI of T. I, of course, because there is a person index. We can forget about all these details. This variable is shown in the figure. This is not actually a drawn figure. It's a figure that is from calculated values of P for the various categories of cases. So if you look at this figure, the lowest category, the asymptomatic and recovered patients, that's a population where one gets more or less sick, doesn't need hospitalization, eventually recovers. The next group, which is category 2, ends up getting sicker and hospitalized, and category 3 and 4, 3 is those who expire, and 4 are the ones who recover after an ICU stay. So you can see that's how we categorize that. The initial condition part of it is very important. There are a small number of people who initially must carry the virus, and if this number is not terribly small, essentially not killed off, then the growth rate can get really bad. And that may be what we are seeing now. In fact, I'm reasonably convinced that's what we are probably seeing now. We took a seeding of 0.01%. So if you take a population of a million, 10 to the 6, 0.01% would be 10 to the minus 4. So that of the population, so that's about 100 people. So again, larger seed means a greater spread. If cases go to nearly zero, spreading can be well controlled. If not, it may not be well controlled, as we see now. Again, I just make that statement. More details. I mentioned public places. People go out to public places, and it is not necessarily that trivial to find the typical number of public places in a region. So we took N public, the number of public places, C as the average capacity of a public place, and took that to be 0.1 times N. In this case, it's just 0.1 times N that's taken. That's how we have characterized the numbers of public places for our simulations. But this particular detail actually will need to be changed as we now go through the refinement of the model, which we are doing now. There is quite a bit of literature on the number of public places per 5,000 people. So this equation needs to be fixed up a little bit. We are not wildly off, but we can be a lot more accurate. That's the main point. So the sensitive variables in our model, other than the seeding part, are the p-values. So here we categorize just the transition rates. So the effective viral load variable is activated in the simulations once a person comes in contact. In contact basically means is in the same public place where there is another infected agent. So this is very simplistic. This is not how it works. We all know that. But that's how it's built into the model. This particular part of the study also needs more refinement. And that can be fairly easily done by introducing a coefficient. So the EVL, once a person acquires a viral load, that keeps growing until it reaches a threshold, at which point a person's infection level may stabilize, and he or she can stay sick for a period and then recover. So this is the category 1. Recovery is assumed to be exponential in time, as there should be a characteristic time scale for a recovery. We all know that if there is a characteristic time scale, typically that would be exponential recovery. If there isn't one, that would be algebraic recovery, which may well be possible here, although the results may not be so badly affected by such a small change. The transition from category 1 to category 2 is P12. So we have to pick a number for P12. And this is something that we are picking out of thin air right now. For category 2 patients, the EVL keeps growing until a higher threshold is reached. At this point, the patient will have to be in the hospital. And we have assumed this period to be randomly between 3 to 6 days. We have also varied it between 6 to 12 days in some studies. But the difference isn't a whole lot in terms of outcomes. By outcomes, I mean measurement of hospitalization and ICU numbers. A patient has a probability of recovering exponentially or transitioning to an ICU patient. And we call this P2 and then 3-4. So 3-4 would be in ICU. In ICU, category 4, these are the patients who recover exponentially in time. And category 3 are the patients who will not recover, who will pass away. So that's how the model is set up. And let me lay down a little bit of the simulation details. In every time step, an agent in category 1 is randomly picked to visit a public place. A successful step would be when public places are not up to capacity and an agent can make a visit. That's the first thing. Secondly, agent spends a very short time in our model, an average of 10 minutes in a public place. I have never been to a grocery store for 10 minutes. I take more than that. But that's what we assumed. We can increase it a little bit. It might change numbers a little bit, but hopefully not very much. So there are 144 steps a day in the way we simulate it. That's the minimum. We can take more steps. Again, no major impact here. So agent's viral load goes up if there is an infected agent in the public place. However, this does not mean the agent gets sick, because remember, you have to get sufficiently high viral load to get category 1 and then category 2 and so on. Agent's viral load keeps rising until threshold is reached for P12. If agent continues to proceed to Cat2, there are 3 possibilities: straight away recover, ICU and recover, and ICU and death. We assume no transmission at home for now. I know this is not a good assumption. This was the way we started, assuming that quarantine was perfect. I've been looking into the literature on this, and I'm sure there is a lot of expertise in this group on this. My general sense is that this number depends upon the age categories and comorbidity data. That kind of detail can be built in a regional level, in a neighborhood scale with zip codes. And that might actually be useful if we want to track, for example, this large growth in COVID cases that we are seeing. So this is something we are actually very interested in adding. And we obviously calculated the number of hospitalization ICU cases as our main thing to calculate. And as I mentioned, the sensitive parameters that we have are P12, which is the transition probability for hospitalization, P234, transition probability between category 2 and 3 and 4, P34, transition probability between category 3 and 4, and then the seed. And for the various regions we looked at, I won't be showing you the Mid-Hudson data. For the New York City data, I'll be showing you briefly. We have done many simulations of New York City. And Western New York also we can show you briefly. Western New York numbers when we started were quite small. So we could actually get pretty good agreement with the kind of numbers for P12, P234, and P34 shown here. The main point that we saw was that P12 was quite small in Western New York. The number of public places we ended up working with to get to the data was 0.8%. I have no idea if that's good or bad, if that's right or wrong. For New York City, the number of public places actually is not off the ballpark. We have checked it. The rest of the numbers, of course, we had to construct these numbers to get the data we see by trial and error. So moving on, here's the New York City data, both the data from the state, which is on the left, this one here, and data from the right, which is what we have simulated with the public place capacity, in this case of 10%. And if you look closely, there are reasonable similarities. There are places where we fall short. For example, if you look at the very beginning, around the 5-day mark, our numbers are very small. And that's basically because of the way we initiate the problem. We are not using the kind of initiation parameters that actually were in effect when we make the comparison. So ours may be a little too simplistic. So our growth curve is a bit steeper, which in turn causes some issues. So knowing that seed part is kind of important. Moving on, New York City hospitalization, actually, we are able to simulate rather well if you look at this data in detail. But New York City ICU, not so well. We actually have been struggling to get this right. We can improve that, accepting that these simulations take several days. So at some point, we had to kind of call it quits for now. But this also, the improvement of this ICU data perhaps requires us to revisit the transition rates that we are currently using. The Western New York population has been a challenge. On the left is Western New York data from the state. This is for a period from, as I said, from late March till mid-May. That's the period we are using for comparison purposes. Same period here on the right with the simulated data. And in our studies, while the numbers are not far off, it's a little off, not far off, but the hospitalization part of it certainly is not very good. I can show you a somewhat more detailed scale, like I showed you just now for New York City. Let's go there. Again, the ICU part has been quite challenging for us, so maybe our ICU needs refinement. Hospitalization part, also the decay that we get from our model is actually much better than what we see in the real data, which is what makes me feel that if our parameters are not terribly off, there is a lot of regionality that we are missing, which has attracted me to look into the regional issues, local area issues. What happens if you do a complete lockdown? There is a temporary reprieve, but not a very big one. That's what the simulations seem to suggest. Initially, the lockdown basically should lead to reduction in hospitalization and ICU cases. Maybe we are modeling it more dramatically than what we should see, but one would expect that to happen anyway. What is surprising is that 8 to 16 days in our model is still not enough, because 8 to 16 days, after 8 to 16 days, the way it comes back is pretty scary. It's as if nothing much has happened. We'll never know unless we actually do the simulation to actually measure the impact of the lockdown, which we haven't done. But nevertheless, it appears that unless the seed part of it is more or less obliterated, we will not be able to get the kind of results that we are seeking in terms of controlling the virus. So wrapping up, what's good? Well, given the initial conditions, given the category transition rates, both of which may be inferred from data and perhaps data combined with trial and error. We have genetic algorithms and so on that we can try. A number of public places can be known. We can make broad predictions, which are probably 80 to 90% correct in predicting hospitalization and ICU numbers in a region. So that's the good news if we are trying to be optimistic. If category transition rates are slowing down due to social distancing, et cetera, we can infer its consequences within some bounds. That can also be done. What next? Look at the pandemic dispersion at the neighborhood level. This is something that, as I mentioned, we are aspiring to get to, and we are trying to do now. For this, we need census data, attempting to do this now. We are breaking down the population into distribution of families of various sizes and modeling individual family types. We are also taking account of COVID-19 spread in the homes and neighborhoods, neighborhood specifics. So that's roughly where we are, and I'll stop right there and try to get out of the presentation. Let me see.
Thank you. I assume you'll be willing to take some questions or comments at this point.
Absolutely. I'm just stop share. Let me just stop sharing. Yeah, now I'm back in track. Yes, absolutely.
Well, I'll ask one. One of the things that has what we've talked about this a little bit, and is that the model is very mathematical in the sense that it's your sense of how the virus spreads with viral loads and these probabilities of state transitions is approaching the pandemic very much from this mathematical standpoint. And one of the questions remains, in my mind, is how well that reflects the biology of the virus, because many of the people on this call think about it from the, you know, the biology standpoint, the virology standpoint, the
Right.
epidemiological standpoint, which is a somewhat different approach. The probabilities of state transition from well to infected to hospitalization, et cetera, to some extent, and I think we've gotten those from actual observational data, is how, you know, what fraction of people wind up in the ICU, et cetera. And so at least those numbers we can make sure are okay. But because the approach is so different, it's really interesting to me that, first of all, the New York City data winds up matching pretty well. Leave ICU for a moment. The New York City hospitalization matches well, but the Western New York data doesn't match well.
Mm.
And you pointed out, I mean, you're ascribing that to regionality, which may be true. It's very, I'm struggling to explain that,
Mm.
because at least in my head, it's hard to translate the viral load model and the into this kind of virology model. Anyway, I'm babbling a little bit, obviously,
No, no.
but again, it's a very different view of the pandemic, and coming up with that disparate outcome, I think, is quite interesting.
Thanks. Yeah, I think right. So the original motivation for trying this approach was to try and mimic what we would do in a dynamical systems problem. Uh, if you're looking at a material system and so on, you can describe a system uh, minimally at this level of detail, if not much more. So my hope was to try and take that picture and try it out here. Uh, the approach does have some power, I feel, in terms of identifying possible problem areas. When I say problem areas, I mean problem areas where either the model is not working or the data is not good or something is off somewhere. So it's good at that. I have really soul searched on why we are missing out on the Western New York data. The easier answer may be that we are really not modeling the human behavior well, because ultimately this human behavior aspect of it possibly ties in with what kind of policies one wants to make, right? Because you want people to behave a certain way to control the pandemic, and if the model can give some insights into what kind of behavior perhaps can help, then that will be quite nice. So that's where I was coming from, and uh, the pictures that we constructed seem to be inadequate uh, at this point, certainly the long time tail part. So what it means is that you can simulate the up part of it quite well, but we are not simulating the other side of it. And one reason why we are probably not simulating the other side of it could be biology. The other part of it, that people are carrying the virus for a very long time, and so even if they're nominally recovered, they're actually not recovered. You see, we haven't built in that scenario. And as a result, they may be, so the number of infective agents that are around, which we are thinking of as recovered, may be way higher than what it is. So there may be some correlation between the actual numbers we see and the biology that is speaking to us. And this is a topic in which we would very much welcome, thoughts and suggestions, because it can be fixed. We can do trial and error to see if we can get to another level.
This is Tim Murphy. This is very interesting
Thank you.
model and discussion. Thank you so much. Let me maybe add to that what you just said, perhaps about human behavior and so forth. And so we look at even that zip code chart that we were just looking at, where, you know, a high zip code, there are high rates in the east side of Buffalo, and there are high rates in Amherst and Clarence. And yet, if we look at what's happening in those two environments, you know, in the east side of Buffalo, there are a large percentage of essential workers who are going out to public places all the time. There are lots of multi-generational households. So the essential workers are coming home and exposing elderly relatives.
Mhm.
The rates of underlying illnesses in the east side population compared to Clarence and Amherst is much higher. So that's going to affect that ratio of cases to hospitalizations to deaths and so forth. And so I think your idea of looking at census tracts begins to get at that, but those are like, I'm guessing that, that if you could get down to that level of detail, the models would look very different in those two different kinds of environments, just as an example.
Mhm. So what we are doing is we actually have now the data from uh, the hospitalization ICU data from Peter with zip codes. And we have the census data uh, that we ported to zip codes. Census doesn't like zip codes because zip codes have a certain level of grayness, and the census doesn't use it. It uses the counties. So that's, of course, much larger length scale. Zip codes are much smaller length scale. At any rate, we have tried to do our best in terms of bringing the two pieces of information together. The files are big. They have several thousand columns and so on, but we don't need everything. Anyway, the point is that what we can do is we can make this model specifically for local regions and mesh up the local regions to make the global region model. That's the way I think would be a little bit better. So in other words, for example, if you're talking east side of Buffalo, we can make a model that is basically for east side of Buffalo only. Number of public places in east side of Buffalo would be different. People's behavior would be different. So more or less, all these parameters would change, and we do have the capacity to actually bring about that change without too much trouble. Whereas for Amherst or Clarence, as you said, behaviors are different. Family structures are often different too. Age demographics is different. Comorbidities are different. So that would be a completely different city. So we can break down the region into a much more granular scale. And that would be the way we were thinking of approaching it, if we at all can. But the struggle is finding the resources right now, because this kind of work requires some help at some level, because as I said, I'm working evenings and Aman is an undergrad, so we can only pull in some.
I posted several things in the chat. The zip code data link is there. Link to the talk tomorrow morning is there, or the flyer which has a link in it. I posted a MMWR article that came out a few weeks ago about household transmission rates, because you mentioned that was kind of the next phase in the model. And I just posted a preprint from Nature, which is another modeling paper that talks about mobility disparities. They actually use a lot of mobility. You probably saw that one, and they clearly saw disparities, Tim, based on census tracts, and basically the lower income census tracts tend to have more of the so-called essential workers, and they're the ones getting out and about. They also have a very interesting, which I'm hoping to get to when I talk about it tomorrow. They have a very interesting graph on which business types seem to contribute most to infection spread based on their data, and it won't surprise you. It's the indoors without a mask places that are a problem. But they actually have some data to support that. So anyway, that's all posted in the chat.
Okay. Yeah, I'm trying to recover the PDF file. I'm having a bit of trouble, but if you can send it to me by email.
I can email that. I can email that out to the group when we're done.
Okay, thank you so much. So yeah, so great. I'm really pleased at the comments, and I would welcome any and all help, collaboration, whatever you want. This is a tough challenge. I've never worked on a problem with this much granularity, which is not surprising, I suppose. But it's a bit much to be very honest.
Other thoughts or comments? Thank you. Yeah, I think it's fascinating work.
Thank you.
And I'm very much of the opinion that the more variety of eyes and approaches on the problem, the better, because each thing teaches us something. the modeling that we've been working with, as you saw, is very non-granular. It's very homogeneous. I mean, that's how the SEIR models are. They're extremely homogeneous, which is fine for some things, but isn't fine for other things. And so a much more granular model, I think, is helpful, and especially as we start talking about disparities, and that's going to become that may become that discussion may heat up very rapidly when we start talking about vaccine distribution. Where do you get, aside from the equity issues, which are critical, and I don't mean to minimize them, there's going to be a question of where do you get your most bang for your buck?
Exactly.
You want to get those vaccines out, assuming you have sterilizing immunity. You want to get those vaccines out. And by the way, I'm now way out of my realm here. I got Tim and John here who know a million times more about this than I do. But it seems to me that you want to get your vaccine out to those places where obviously you want to protect the individuals, but also you want to interrupt the chain of transmission as much as possible. So where the heck do you put the vaccines before you can have enough for everybody? Where do you put the vaccines first to interrupt the chain of transmission? And I think that's a real interesting question. And I'm sure people are thinking about it. I have no idea.
I didn't really think about it quite as much, but I was more interested in tracking down the puppets. But now that you mention it, yeah, I mean, this is a very big deal, because if we know the areas where things are getting really bad, those are probably the areas where you want to first attack the distribution part of it, and then so you can prioritize. It's not about discrimination, it's about prioritization. And that may be worthwhile. Well, I won't hold you guys up. I'll take leave. Thank you for the opportunity, and we'll be in touch.
Great. Thank you very much. And I'll try to figure out how to get you the link to this recording if I can ever figure out where it is.
You will get an email from Zoom. When I run a seminar series every Saturday, so it'll come to you. So you can just download it, or put it on Box, and I can take it from Box.
That's what I'll do. All right.
All right. Thanks, Peter. Take care. Bye-bye. Thank you.